Shine.fm presents Stronger Together, a show about growing in marriage, parenting, relationships, and community. Here's Seth Tower Hurd.
Dr. Casey Tygrett joins me for this episode of Stronger Together. He's the author of the book Becoming Curious, the spiritual practice of asking questions, and is also a pastor and spiritual director in the Chicago area. So we're talking about kids and the questions they ask today and how those questions actually can be of help to having a better relationship with you as their parent and with God as their creator. Dr. Tygrett, going to go right at a tough one here, right out of the gate. We're going to keep this family friendly, but one of my former coworkers came to me and said that her 10-year-old was asking big questions about substances that used to be illegal in the United States that are now legal for, in some cases, recreational use in certain areas. And what does the Bible have to say about that? And what does it look like as a Christian to live in that kind of society? And those are big questions for, a fourth or a fifth grader. So you're saying that is it necessarily a bad thing that those big, tough questions are coming up earlier and earlier? Can you tell me about that?
Well, I think the first thing, as a parent of a 10-year-old, the first thing that comes to mind for me is what that does to us as adults. The first thing as an adult we do, especially those of us who really understand the responsibility of parenting, is that it causes us to clench a little bit, because that question reminds us that there is a bigger world that we've learned how to deal with that they're just now starting to encounter. And so the substance question is one of like 1,000. And all of a sudden we feel like that door has been kicked open, and now, oh my gosh, where are they going to go from here? This question is troubling enough. What about the next ones? So I think the first thing for us, and the first thing that I try and do, is be very grateful and thankful that my daughter would actually ask me that she wouldn't just try and either figure it out on her own or pretend or ask her friends. I think sometimes, as much as questions make us quake, also a sense of, oh, I'm so thankful she's asking me about this. And she's not just, taking some time and searching Google and finding out, what it is out there that's common knowledge. So with that question, how we handle it is a lot of it's based on what we know about our kids too. So there's a great deal of self-knowledge and also knowledge of our children that helps us to say, here's something that is going to be a part of your life. You're going to be dealing with these things, whether it's substances or whether it's physical relationships, whatever it might be. This is going to be part of the rest of your life. And so figuring out there are times in our life when we want to choose things for the sake of that they make us feel good or that we're curious about the impact of them. And for a lot of us, it can become something that we begin to get connected with. And so explaining addiction to a 10-year-old is probably a good place to start, because you don't want to scare them, but you also want to be realistic. And I think responding to those questions with realism and also saying, God has built us and our bodies to work in a certain way. And that's why substances have the impact they do, because they jump on stuff that's already designed in our bodies. But that doesn't mean it's a good thing. And so kind of explaining the nature of people and how we're made and how God made us, and that there's a sacredness to that, and how we interact with how God made us can help either to celebrate that and we connect more with God by knowing how we're made, or we can also kind of take a different road with that and begin to tear down and destroy some of those things that God has built in us.
With Dr. Casey Tygrett, the book is Becoming Curious. We're talking about kids and questions and how sometimes those can be tough, but ultimately your kids asking you questions can help them grow closer to you and closer to God. Okay, so it's easy as a parent to maybe say, oh, I wish that I didn't have these questions coming up. I wish I didn't have them coming up so early. Why is this actually beneficial? Can you go into that a bit?
Asking questions, especially those early childhood questions, is a way that we learn to own things. We learn to not only own the world that we live in. I mean, the reason they say kids up to the age of 4 ask 300 to 400 questions a day. And the reason they do that is because they're trying to wrap their arms around the world that they live in. And so in some ways, questions like, well, wait a minute, I just read this part of the Bible where God seems really angry and is striking people down. And then I read about Jesus who talks about love one another. How can those two things live together? what that is not, I'm trying to beat a path out of the faith that I grew up in. It's, I'm trying to put my hands around the fact that I go to a church that has taught me to learn from and grow from the Bible, and the Bible has these pieces in it that don't seem to fit together. And so again, trying to honor how good those questions are, because they really are an attempt to put their hands around and to own their own faith. What happens when we say, well, that's just the way it is? Because we have two responses when we get that question. One is to say, well, I don't know. Let's talk about that. Let's explore it, which I feel like is a much more honest and helpful way of doing it. Or we say, nope, this is the way it is. That's the way it's always been. You either believe it or you don't. And if you don't, there are consequences to your faith. When we do that, what we're basically doing is we're giving them an opportunity to not have to deal with it. To honor the question is actually saying, yeah, you are asking me this, and this is a good opportunity for you to deal with that piece of the Bible or that piece of faith, or, that physical overcoming feeling that we have when we think about the concept of eternity. I remember as a kid thinking about that, like, what, time not ending? I remember being 7 and now I'm 10, and that time moved on, but I know that I'm growing up, and that there's some finality to these things. And then you think about time never ending. That's an overwhelming concept. We should have some questions about that. So I think in the faith question, in the faith discussion, giving some safe space for that to happen, giving some space for kids to ask questions that we may look at and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're asking that. And also, as a parent, really and truthfully, it's more about us. It's more about our insecurities coming out. When our child asks us a question, we're like, I feel like I need to nail that one down. And if I don't nail it down, then his whole faith is going to implode. And I understand that pressure because I feel it too. But I also know God has to be bigger. It has to be bigger than that. It has to give us space for those questions.
With Dr. Casey Tygrett. The book is Becoming Curious, a spiritual practice of asking questions, talking about those questions that come up in parenting that sometimes you're not ready for at all. Let's, as a pastor who sees families at all stages of life, right? Let's talk a little bit about how the ages that kids kind of come into questions have changed. This is a little bit of anecdotal data, but my mom's a teacher, and she recently said that the stuff that kids who were freshmen and sophomores in high school were dealing with a generation ago is now what 7th grade is today. So when we talk about, tough cultural questions, tough theological questions with your kids, like your daughter's 10. So how do you know when it's time to talk to your kid about X? And, there's probably 2 or 3 big topics we all think of, with fill in the blank there, but there's a lot of theological and societal stuff that's going on right now that kids have to have questions about the Bible about.
Yeah. Well, there's a few things that you have to factor in. Number one, you have to factor in that kids, as you said, Seth, kids are picking up and asking questions now that we didn't ask until 2 or 3 years later. My daughter has asked me things that I don't think I even considered until I was 14 or 15, much less, and she's 10. So knowing that that's going to happen, just being prepared for that is part of it. Second thing would be just to know our kids, to know what they've experienced, what they understand. So some of it can be what reading level, like at what reading level are your kids? What kind of concepts are they reading into? What kind of things are they picking up from the media that they consume, and knowing what they're watching. So some of this is just all around parenting stuff. To know what our kids are consuming online, if at all, to know what our kids are watching on television, if at all, is going to help us understand what questions are going to come. And also having them in some kind of environment where they're, especially when it comes to questions of faith, where they're learning about faith. What does that environment look like? What kind of support system is there? Is there someone other than you? Because here's the deal. Our kids will listen to somebody else other than us 98% of the time. As much as we want to think that, they're like, oh, hanging on our every word. Oh, mother, father, you're so wise. It's just not happening, man. Your neighbor could come along and say the same thing you've been saying for years. And they'd be like, hey, did you know this? Like, yes, we've been telling you this forever. So understanding the influences that are in our kids' lives as well. And I think for us, one of the things that's been critical is preparing our daughter to understand that she is going to go to school with people who do not share her worldview. And the more diversity racially, the more diversity religiously that she encounters, the more she needs to be ready for that. So just to prepare them to not reject something that's different as weird immediately, but to say, what is that all about? We had a professor in college that said, you don't say something strange or weird. You say, that's different. I wonder why they do it that way. And that has been really, really helpful. And we've passed that on to her as well. So preparing your kids at different stages for those questions, it's a lot about them, understanding how they're made up and how you've raised them. If your household is a household that welcomes a lot of discussion, expect them to have more questions, because you've given them an opportunity for it. If you've created a household where I've said it, that settles it, we move on, I would not expect a whole lot of curiosity, a whole lot of questions to be passed around your dinner table.
This is Stronger Together. It's the show about growing in marriage, parenting, relationships, and community. Dr. Casey Tygrett joins me, Chicago area pastor and author of the book Becoming Curious. We're talking about the questions your kids ask and how to help them grow closer to you and closer to God through helping guide them. Parenting in 2018 is different than in 2014 even, because we've now entered the full-on tablet era where having a tablet, an iPhone, whatever, has just become a part of childhood. And with that is the expectation that kids are going to be watching YouTube. To throw out a crazy statement at you, Disney, like the Disney Channel used to be like the biggest thing in childhood, right? Disney even admits now that they're lagging behind YouTube stars as far as capturing kids' attention. So how do we deal with this in parenting? Because there's some fantastic stuff on YouTube, and there's also some stuff that no 6 or 8 or 10 or maybe even 12-year-old is ready for.
Yeah, and honestly, YouTube is interesting because there's two factors for me. One is what you mentioned is the oversight and controls. The other thing is something, and I don't even know if this is the term. I'm sure there's a term for it. For me, it's the thing that's called the second click, because it's very rarely what they search for. It's the algorithm that generates you may also like videos down the side. And so what I've noticed is I keep track of that more so than, usually our kids go to YouTube with some genuine interest in something that's probably good for them to watch. It's just the stuff that clicks down the side. And the other thing I notice is the personality-centric programming that's on YouTube right now. There are a lot of questions that come out of that, especially when you've got a monologue or a YouTube star who's kind of built their brand around themselves. Younger kids look at that and say, well, this person believes this, and they put a lot of stock in that. And as I said before, it's the whole thing of they have a YouTube channel. That's what I want. And they have an expertise, and I want that, and I want to believe that. And so following in that line. So I pay attention. We have an open policy with search histories. So if you're a parent and you don't know how that device works, first of all, you need to study how your kids' devices work. If they use Safari, if they use Chrome, if they use something else, figure out how to search your kids' internet browsing history. Safari, I think, is the easiest. It just has there's one touch on the iPad, but it depends on what device you're using. The other thing is, most devices have an opportunity to set parental controls and passwords. Don't be afraid to do that. Heard a great interview with Krista Tippett, and she was interviewing a person who does internet ethics, which is needs to be a more rapidly growing field. But he said this, he said, you've got to remember, when it comes to technology, we're still the grown-ups in the room. Technology is the toddler. And I think that's critical for those of us who are parents to realize technology is still the child that needs to be managed. We can't depend on it to do its own self-policing, because that's not going to happen. So setting some parental controls is really important, keeping an eye on history, and talking to your kids about why you're doing it. Don't do it all KGB cloak and dagger behind the scenes. Tell them, I'm going to look at your history and here's why, because I think it's important for them to know why that's happening.
This is Stronger Together. It's a show about growing in marriage, parenting, relationships, and community. My name is Seth Tower Hurd. We are with Dr. Casey Tygrett, Chicago area pastor and author of the book Becoming Curious, talking about the questions your kids ask and how to help them develop their curiosity and their question asking to grow closer to you and closer to God. Okay, this one's a little dicey. I'm someone who works and lives in the digital space, and I see YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter as tools just as much as I see, arithmetic, writing, reasoning that kids are going to need to be able to have careers and to get ideas to move around in the world. However, I also see the other side of the coin where every 11-year-old wants to be a YouTube star right now. And there certainly does seem to be some pretty heavy implications for allowing your kid to go down that road. You're the parent of a 10-year-old. Can you just help me unpack this world where kids can actually become stars online well before they can get a driver's license?
Yeah, and the great thing is, I think the helpful thing for those of us as parents is it's tempting for us to look at it and go, this is so new. And I'm not old. I feel old some days, but I'm just turned 40 this past November, and I realize I've flipped a page in a calendar that's significant. But it's easy to look at the technology that our kids are using, especially if you have kids under, say, 16. Even then, if they're teenagers, look at that technology and go, man, it's just so vast. I don't understand it. But at the core of it is something that's been true of human beings forever, which is we are often drawn to personalities especially that seem to convey a vision of life as we'd like for it to be. And that's one of the things about, there's a spiritual writer and philosopher, Dallas Willard. One of the things that I've loved about him is he said, spiritual formation is really believing that Jesus lived the best life ever. And if that's the case, then why wouldn't we want to be like him? And I think that's powerful. But what it does is it's the flip of why YouTube works, which is when you see these YouTube stars and they have the personality and the appearance and the following, 51 million hits and all of those things. It's a human nature thing that's been in existence since humans have, which is we all get drawn to charismatic personalities. The question is, who is it that we shape ourselves after? And what I love about stuff that I'm reading about millennial generations is there's this craving for wisdom. My generation was much more about explosiveness and impact and people being authentic and real. But there's a reason why a lot of millennials would rather spend time with their grandparents than their parents, which is because there's this value of that sage wisdom that comes with time. And so if YouTube stars are replacing that in our kids' lives, then we really shouldn't be surprised when some of the things come out of them that might come out of them. And so that is the challenge, is moving our kids into a space where we're teaching them that actually the best life a human being has ever lived is Jesus. That faith is about, I get into this discussion all the time, and I know it's controversial, but Jesus spent so much more time talking about how we live here on earth than he did about what happens after we die. And what I fear is that we've created a faith that only cares about what happens when our heart stops beating, rather than what happens to us in the lifetime in between. And so helping our kids have a vision of spiritual life here and now, where Jesus is actually shaping our heart, our will, and our desires. And then contrasting that against, maybe it's even, if we want to get really practical, sit down with your kids and, okay, who's your YouTube star that you're watching these days? Let's talk about the stuff that they're advocating. Let's compare that to what we hear from Jesus. And at the end result, which of these is a better life? And I think moderating our expectations there is helpful, because I don't think they're going to come out of that going, yes, of course, it is Jesus. We're so excited because we've all been kids, right? We fight that like easy stuff, because wisdom isn't easy. We fight the stuff that our parents tell us, and because it's just our nature. We're growing into our own people, but eventually that seed gets planted and it begins to grow.
This is Stronger Together. It's a show about growing in marriage, parenting, relationships, and community. Dr. Casey Tygrett's with me, and we're talking about the questions your kids ask and how to help them grow spiritually through those. Okay, really young kids. Everybody that's ever been around like a 4-year-old knows that there's like the 17 whys, right? Like, well, why does the dishwasher work? Well, because we put dirty dishes and soap in it. Well, why does the soap get the stuff off of the dishes? Well, because, and you explain how soap works. And then there's 17 more why questions, right? And I'm guessing that every single person that's done that with a 4-year-old eventually gets worn out by it. But what you're saying is this is actually something that can really help kids understand who God is ultimately and grow spiritually in their young lives. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, the positive, for me, the positive is that curiosity is actually something that's wired into us. So when the kids are asking those thousands of why questions, what they're doing is they didn't learn to be curious. They came out curious because they had no idea what the world was about. And so they were asked questions because they need to know. Why doesn't the dishwasher work? Well, I've never seen a dishwasher before. This is whole new territory for us. And so as we grow into adults, we start to lose that. And I think one of the reasons we lose it is because there is a perception that other people have as we grow into adulthood of people who ask a lot of questions. They either are annoyed by them or they see them as, haven't you figured this out yet? And so that desire to say, you've figured it out, you've arrived, you've gotten all the boxes checked. And yet when I look at Jesus spends this 3-year ministry, depending on which scholars you read. And in that 3-year ministry, Jesus asks or answers around 183 questions. Now, if curiosity is not important, he should have spent way more time telling people what to do and giving very definite parameters. And yet, it seems like Jesus is bent on stoking that in people. And I think the reason why is because in the Gospels it says, unless you become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And I don't think that's a permission thing. Like, unless you're a kid, you're not allowed in. It's unless you're willing to go back to that kind of childlike curiosity, this brand new kingdom is going to be way beyond your grasp. And so he's stoking people's curiosity, saying, these guys named James and John come to him and say, we want you to do whatever we want. And he says, what do you want me to do for you? Which is ridiculous because Jesus knew these two guys and they were impulsive and they were, the kind of guys that wanted to do everything by force. And Jesus looks at them and says, what do you want me to do for you? And in asking them that question, he invites them to a process of learning. When our kids ask questions, what they're doing is they're opening the door for us to teach them something. Here's how the dishwasher works. And so I think Jesus was doing the same thing, but he does it for us as adults because he's saying there's a brand new kingdom that God is bringing to bear in the world, and you have no idea how it works. And so you'll grow closer to me by trusting me. And in doing that, he called disciples. I love that. I love that he called disciples. Disciples are learners. He didn't call experts. There were plenty of experts around that he could have said, hey, come follow me. Let's build this thing. Instead, he called guys who knew that they didn't know. And so I would rather be a disciple than an expert. I'd rather be curious enough to know that I don't know everything I need to know. And I think that's where the growth really happens for us because it's such a position of vulnerability. It's such a position of trust. I mean, as a pastor, for someone to ask me a question and for me to go, I don't know. We're going to have to think about that. There's a real walk the plank kind of moment that happens when you do that. So there's a vulnerability in asking questions that teaches us to trust that even if I don't know this right now, I can rest in the fact that God is caring for me and is welcoming my questions no matter what they are.
This is Stronger Together, the show about growing in marriage, relationships, parenting, and community. Talking about the questions your kids ask with Dr. Casey Tygrett. He's the author of the book, Becoming Curious, a spiritual practice of asking questions. Okay, so when I was growing up as what I'll call an elder millennial, there was kind of this idea in the 80s and 90s, unfortunately, that I think permeated the church, that you have this kind of Christian life over here and you have your secular life over here, and those two things don't really meet. And so I maybe didn't think about when I was, like, let's say in 5th grade and a pretty nerdy kid and reading books on economics and wanting to talk about those things with adults, that actually was something that God was going to use later in my life as I went into business, and that was actually a holy calling to develop a tool that I could use to grow the kingdom of God. Talk to me about the questions your kids ask that aren't necessarily like, hey, what about the Bible? What about Jesus questions, but are more just about the world that they live in and what they're excited about, because I don't think we want to kind of wrap our arms around this idea that you go to church and that's your, sacred life, and then you leave for your secular life and we go watch football afterwards, and the Super Bowl's coming up, so we get the little hot dogs on a stick, like in the barbecue sauce. Like we don't want to separate our lives out like that.
Well, first of all, if those little hot dogs are wrapped in bacon, you may be finding heaven right there. So let's just be honest about it. Yeah. It strikes me how often we are willing to put things that are anything that's human, anything that addresses the human condition, our bodies, our hearts, our brains, our relationships, any of that relates to our life with God, because when you read Jesus, 98% of his teaching require us to have a body and some relationships in order to keep it. And so when kids are asking questions about their friends and, why is there why is there so much drama? That's one of the things we deal with, is why do girls have so much drama? That's a good question. Let's talk about that. And that actually has to do with the way that you express patience, the way that you do honesty. When Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no, that is a conversation about girl drama if I have ever heard it. Because where does it all start? It all starts with, well, this and the misdirection, and guys aren't above it either. I mean, we always go for who's got the strongest dad or who's the fastest and all this competitive stuff. And then you get Jesus saying, if you want to be first, sometimes you got to be last. And so I think all of that, all those questions that have to do with these, what seems like a non-spiritual, non-God moment, are actually building up into something much bigger, which is how you see yourself and how you see God. Richard Rohr, who's a great spiritual writer, says, if we want to know, our image of God says everything about us. The way that we see God will change everything we do, from the way that we eat, to the way that we relate to each other, to the way that we think about ourselves, to the kind of work that we'll do. And so any of those questions, like, what should I do for a living? Gosh, that's an image of God question. What do you think God's up to in the world? And how can you meet him in what he's doing? And so I think there are no such thing as unspiritual questions. And if we see it as that, man, that means that our conversation with our kids about those questions is actually pretty sacred.
This is Stronger Together. Been hanging out with Dr. Casey Tygrett. He's the author of the book Becoming Curious, a spiritual practice of asking questions, which is available wherever books are sold. Stronger Together can be heard each week on Shine.fm and is all about helping you grow in marriage, parenting, relationships, and community. My name is Seth Tower Hurd. And by the way, if you've got an idea for a future show, hit me up. Just shoot me a message on any of the Shine.fm social media channels. Would love to hear your thoughts on some content that we might feature in the future. Hey, by the way, if you missed any portion of this on the radio, you can always check out the video in its entirety on YouTube or on the Shine.fm Facebook page, or subscribe to the podcast wherever you get audio at by searching Shine.fm podcasts.
That was Stronger Together, a show about growing in marriage, parenting, relationships, and community. Subscribe to the Shine.fm podcast to catch every episode of Stronger Together, available on the iTunes podcast app and wherever podcasts are available.